Caleb, what movie are we talking about today?
We are talking about the Terminator today.
Oh, that's right. You better believe it. Hey, guys, welcome back to the fourth episode of the Internet World Order podcast. Today, we are talking about one of my all time favorite sci fi movies, The Terminator.
Yes, and also one of my favorites. I may like the sequel more, but actually watching this showed me how good the first one is and how well the story holds up.
It's one of those few movies, like, this is just me, but like, I'm not super big on time travel a lot of the time because I think it just leaves a lot of holes, which is like, it's in writing it's really hard because there's so much you have to wrap around, but I think that this movie does fairly well because it keeps it incredibly simple and it follows a set of guidelines that I think hold up really, really well, especially now.
Oh yeah, there are guidelines that you could do a time travel story by nowadays, and it would work just fine.
Precisely. But basically, like, the one thing that I realized upon looking back at this movie is that it's basically like it's a slasher movie but with a sci-fi skin. And that doesn't make it simply just a slasher, because it's actually a lot more than that. It's also a great action film with a lot of really great sci-fi elements to it, and it's held up really, really well in that regard. And it's definitely a movie that I think a lot of modern day filmmakers call back to, well, besides T2, especially for action movies. But like, this
Mhm.
movie kind of, it really gave a lot of footing and inspiration to a lot of future filmmakers.
Oh, absolutely. You see, I mean, even just as recently as Zombieland 2 that came out just last year, they made a reference to the Terminator because there's like a super zombie that's like super hard to take down. You could shoot it like 5 times in the head. It kept getting back up. So they nicknamed it the Terminator because
Wasn't it?
to this day it's synonymous of, if you have this unstoppable, bullets cannot slow them down, and they're just a relentless killing machine, the first thing that comes up in your mind is Terminator.
Didn't they call it like a T-8000 or something like that?
Yeah, yeah, they're trying because obviously with it not being a robot, like, yeah, so it's like the zombie version.
Right, right, right. That makes sense. I I'm so glad that we actually chose to talk about this movie, because I haven't heard it talked about in a lot of podcasts. Maybe that's just me, but I love this movie. I saw it when I was maybe 12 years old. I want to say I was 12, and it stuck out for me a lot then, just because I was like genuinely stressed the whole time I was watching this movie. And still am to this day. Like, it was free on YouTube for a while, like with ads, and I rewatched it actually like a couple months ago. Oh, it's so good. So good. I remember, like, I was kind of half watching it because I was like, oh, I've seen this movie before. And then I like really got into it and I was like, oh, this movie rules. This movie's so good. And
Oh no,
I
that
go on.
no, I was like, that's the exact same journey I was on. Saw it as a kid, and uh, I'm so in love with like Terminator 2 that, like, if I'm gonna choose a Terminator movie to watch, I always pick the second one just because I still declare it the perfect action movie because it literally perfectly executes everything an action movie should be. So because of that, it'd been a long time since I'd seen the first one, and so by your suggestion, watching it again, I was like, oh wait, this is really excellent and stands on its own as well. And it's
Right.
just a nice reminder.
It could be its own movie without the sequel, which I'm very glad that they had T2 as a sequel, because it's up there with the Aliens for me in terms of like a perfect action movie. Like, there's
Mm-hmm.
very little about it that I can be like, oh yeah, like, I didn't really like that part of it. It's like, no, this movie's so like intricately done, and there's a lot of practical effects that are used to near perfection, in my opinion. Like, especially with like T2, like there's that scene where they fly the helicopter under the bridge,
Oh
and that
yes.
was a real helicopter, and I was like, that's
Mm-hmm.
terrifying. Like,
Yeah,
that,
and wasn't that also like when the T1000, or I can't remember, the as a 1000, when he has like the 18 wheeler or whatever, like that was legit like 18 wheeler, the LA River on.
yes, yes, it was.
Yeah, so it's like, yeah, they didn't like, so it's not that situation for like they're surrounded by green screens and they're just sitting there stationary. It's like, no, they're actually filming in motion.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. And like, I mean, to talk about that, like in the spirit of the first movie, like almost everything they did was practical except for like obviously like the Terminator at the end. Like that was
Yes.
very much like, stop motion combined with like an actual practical dummy. But
Yeah. Well, it's doing the best you could with what you had back then.
right, it was made for like, I want to say something like in the ballpark of like under $10 million.
I mean, as we were talking before we started recording, when you see the fact that the company that made the budget for or supplied the money for the first Terminator is no longer in existence, it's like, yeah, they didn't have a lot to work with.
Yeah,
They didn't get the big budget till Universal was like, hey, wait a second, there's promise here.
right. And the film director obviously never went on to make another movie again. Never happened.
Yeah,
Absolutely nothing.
no, he didn't set at least a financial record that would stand until literally 2019.
No, no, no. No one's ever heard of James Cameron. What are you talking about?
No, 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 no. Like there's a reason why people like to. He's not the reason why people like to make jokes about floating doors out in the middle of the ocean and a girl may have set a guy up to die. That nothing to do with him.
No, 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 nothing at all. But I love this film for many different reasons. I think there's parts of it obviously that like the movie does sometimes show its age a little bit because it was made
Mm-hmm.
in 1984 and well actually 1983 I think maybe.
Well, not just that. It's also fact like we said before, like it didn't have a mega like huge budget. So even so, like it had both limitations of like technology and money.
Right. And this movie starts out with Sarah Connor, which is one of my favorite heroines in cinema. Like she's had a huge, 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 huge impact on like as a writer, especially like how to write action heroes and how to give them a full character arc. Because at the end of the series, well, I mean, at the end of the movie, she is a fully fleshed out, fully realized character in a
Mm-hmm.
way that certain movies don't always pull off in a way that this movie does. And Linda Hamilton was really, really excellent in the role too.
Oh yeah, like there are movies to this day that they struggle, especially trying to make like, well, they struggle with action heroes, but they'll especially struggle with like female action heroes. And you see this one, and you're just like, what did James Cameron know that y'all didn't? Because he nailed it.
Yeah, I think that because he had this idea for the movie. Well, apparently there was like a some kind of situation with it, but he described the inception of the story as like he was being hunted down by a robot sent from the future, which is literally the
That
plot of the movie. But
that is the whole plot of the franchise.
right, but he like had a nightmare about it because he like had just gotten fired from like his first directing job and he had like this horrible nightmare about it and then went on to make this movie and
Hmm.
it's terrifying. It's literally like it takes slasher elements and combines them with this like future sci-fi epic and it's just honestly like the other movies in the series obviously take a very different approach to like what they present on screen. They're definitely more action based. But this movie was very much like evenly like an action movie and a horror movie in the same regard.
Yeah, and on the note of you talking about like being a slasher, a lot of slashers. Oh, not. I mean, I don't know the percentage, but like, there's some slasher movies they kind of get a little over the top with gore.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes, especially if they're like swinging around a machete or using a knife, whatever their weapon of choice might be. But kind of what made this movie work really well is that it wasn't gory because the Terminator doesn't care about gore. He's efficient.
Right.
So it's just
They're like the
put some
German
bullets in
people.
him, walk away.
He's very much like the German people. They are very efficient. And I admire that. Except not like well, it's like there's a joke here. It's like German people. It's like how many German people does it take to fix a light bulb? One. We are very efficient.
Yeah, and honestly, like there's almost because like this isn't like horror and like you're scared out of your mind. There's nothing that like makes you jump, but it's just you just have this like no, it's a sense of dread because he's out there and he's not. I mean, Kyle Reese, his little like quick like 20-second monologue to Sarah Connor when he's trying to explain to her like what that man is, because she's like, how is this man like, you shot him with a shotgun multiple times, how is he still alive? And he's like, you don't understand, he cannot be bargained with, cannot reason with him. He feels no fear, no pity, no pain, nothing. He is programmed for one mission and one mission only, and he will not stop. And that's terrifying.
That is scary. And one of the crazy things about this movie was when I first started watching it, I didn't know as much about the story because this was actually the first movie I saw in the series. I didn't watch T2 until about a year after I saw this movie because I wanted to watch them all in order.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of thought that there was going to be two people there to kill her because I went in completely blind. I didn't know anything. So
Right.
I am like watching this movie and like I remember Schwarzenegger was like killing her, like, well, not killing her, but killing Sarah Connors around Los Angeles. And the whole time I was like, she's gonna have to fight two people. Like, what? Like, this is crazy. Like, I wasn't quite sure. Like, I had a feeling, but like Kyle Reese also came across like a complete crazy person.
Which I mean, you're going to when you find out about his backstory, and like, it's one of those funny things where you can kind of sit there going, so before he goes to the time machine, no one gives him a primer going, hey, you might want to come up with a good alibi because everyone's going to think you're insane if you just tell them you're from the future.
He goes full into it too and acts like people should believe him. Like he's in 1980s and everyone's like laughing at him and they're like, oh,
as they should.
They're like, oh,
would you believe robots. A guy that says that?
No, but it kind of made him look like an idiot because the whole time he's like, they are efficient killing machines from the future. And like, you know, when they have him and they're interrogating him after they arrest him and Sarah, and he's like, he can't be reasoned with, he can't be bargained with, and he's like screaming at him, and they're just like, dude, like, what proof do you have? Like,
yeah, exactly. That's why that psychologist even says that. He goes, usually people, when they have these weird delusions, it's like it's at least grounded in some sort of reality. This guy's just in another dimension.
I know. And he like just totally was complete disregard for him, and it was kind of oh, it was wild, man. Like I just remembered knowing the whole time I was like, this is gonna be nuts watching that whole scene. And but part of me, like, I kind of want to talk about the Kyle Reese character a little bit more,
sure,
before we get to Sarah Connor, because Sarah Connor is obviously the most important character in the movie, but
okay, it's her movie. Yeah,
it's absolutely her movie, and she's the single most fully realized character in that movie. Her character arc is pretty much perfect because Linda Hamilton plays it off in a way that's, one, extremely believable, and two, it's just so like, it's progressive in a way that is believable because it's not like she just becomes a completely different person, but she becomes a changed person.
Yes.
Kyle Reese. All right.
Yes.
So Kyle Reese. I keep saying that, but
it's like he's in trouble.
He's so much fun to watch on screen because their actor, and I don't know what they told him to do, but I'm so glad that they told him that. Michael Biehn, I think is his name. He just goes full on. Like it's like Al Pacino, but they just only fed him pre-workout for a year. That's all he survived on. And he shows up and he's just screaming the whole movie, and I love it. So like,
yeah, he only has a couple of scenes where he's not like yelling.
He's almost more frightening than the Terminator, and just the fact that he is just so loud and so intense about everything. I was like, dude, you scare me almost as much.
And the best part is, though, that like, you might think that would take away from, oh well, you know, I can't, almost like kind of like the second Indiana Jones movie where the screaming lady just kind of takes you out of it. But Kyle comes across well because when you find out about his backstory in one of the few scenes where he's not yelling, and he talks about it, and you can hear the pain, and you can hear like what he grew up dealing with, you're just like, oh, I'd be kind of a crazy person too.
Right. And another thing I want to talk about, he's a little creepy.
A bit.
He's like, and I don't want to like bash on his character, but like the fact that he fell in love with Sarah Connor based on like one photo of her, like kind of made me squirm a little bit. I was like, ooh, like, ooh.
I let that slide because it's like he grew up in a post-apocalyptic world where you're not exactly going to be trained on social cues
Right. And
or
I
how to interact with people.
yeah, I can understand like the reasoning behind it, but like on just first glance, he's like, "It was for you, Sarah." I was like, like, I don't know how I feel about that one, Kyle. But I also kind of had a feeling because he was like, "You were gonna like be the mother of the man who saves the human race," and I was like, "Well, how is that gonna happen? Like, how are we gonna find out about?"
Of course,
Oh,
and then that clever foreshadowing. She's like, "Well, what about the father's?" Like, "Well, I know he didn't survive. He died before the war." And you're like, "Oh, foreshadowing."
yeah, it's very well written too. Like the screenplay plays into like a lot of the exposition in it. Like the one thing that a lot of like screenplays and a lot of just writing in general runs into is like you have to give your audience exposition, especially with like fantasy and sci-fi movies. There has to be explanations for the rules and what's
Mm-hmm.
going on in the universe. And I think that they actually exposited really, really well in this movie with him because he came across like, I mean, people can say, like, oh, yeah, he's a little over the top, but he delivers it in a way that I would almost believe him.
Yeah, and
Almost.
the and when you see the world he came from, it's like you'd act like that too.
Right. And it makes sense. Like, it's believable that, like, what there's, it didn't come across as like, this is the movie's rules.
Mm-hmm.
You are being explained to because you are a stupid audience member. Like it
Yeah, you
treats
haven't
you
read
like
the
you're
script, so
it treats you like you're smart. It treats you like you can understand what's going on. And I really appreciate that because I don't really like being like treated
talk
like I'm
down to.
stupid. Yeah, it's I'm sure nobody likes that. But
Yeah,
the in movies it's just really hard to kind of like nail that balance of like how do we give them information without forcing it down their throats.
and one of the things the movie does, I think, a great job of is there's a lot of information they just give you through visuals, no dialogue.
Oh,
Like
exactly.
when Kyle first shows up, uh, lightning bolts, all that. You see his back, and you see these scars, and you see all this like tells you right then before you know anything, before you even know the guy's name. Like this is a dude who has been through some stuff, and he has had a rough life. Now, whether like it's because of things he did or just things that were done to him, you didn't know yet, but just little things like that. And I just really appreciated that because I think there are some sci-fi movies where you'll have the person that comes from like this really, really bad future, and yet they look perfectly fine. Like they still have great teeth, great hair, great condition clothes. And you're like, is the future you're from really that bad?
Yeah, I mean they did a good job with that cuz like the actor it's like you got to make him look like he's from a rough and tumble lifestyle. And like the actor himself is like, he was good looking. So it was like you had to find a way to kind of like, for lack of a better way to describe it, like ugly him up a little bit.
I
And
mean, it's accurate.
right. Well, they just like, they didn't do a whole lot to him. And it's not like scars are ugly or anything, but they just like made him look like he didn't, like, he just looked like he was like completely out of it and
Yeah.
completely just like he was literally, and you could see it in his eyes too. So they took it of like, instead of making him like, like ugly in like a sense of like makeup and all that, like they kind of relied on some of that, which is great
Yeah.
because you're trusting your actor and he's giving you something to work with. And it's small things like scars tell a really good sword.
Mm-hmm.
Star, scars tell a really good story. Peter picked
Yes.
a pepper. I even messed that up, but
Quit while you're ahead. Keep
I'm
going.
stopping now. But
Power through.
I think that they did a really good job with him. Like, having his scars be a character element that didn't scream like it wasn't over the top and it wasn't ridiculous, but it was very subtle visual storytelling, like you mentioned.
Yeah. Because like it's not like it. Not to call out a certain movie, but it's not like he had like tattoos that were like, "I'm a survivor" or "Terminator suck, robots are bad."
I
It,
hate Terminators on his
yeah,
chest.
I know. It's like he didn't go that route. They
He
just
just
went the you immediately knew this man was a survivor. Whatever he's been through, he has been through. way too much at his age. Like no one should have to go through as much as he's. You could already tell like he's gone through,
Mhm.
and like you said, and as we've said, like on here on the podcast, like we're coming from the perspective, like for me, actor, for Austin, like writing and all that. So as an actor, when you said like you can tell they trusted the actor to say like, hey, here's the bullet points. We're trusting you to fill in all the gaps.
Mhm.
I think it's the best way to put it because it's like as an actor, it is one of the best things to be told of like, hey, we trust you. Here's what we need you to do. Go do it. We know you'll do a good job. And I mean, it spawned a franchise, and we still talk about this movie to this day. Hence why we're doing the episode. So he did a phenomenal job.
He did. And I want to talk about another actor in this movie, and I think you know who I'm going to talk about. He goes
Yes.
by the name of Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Yes.
And this is one of my favorite roles that he's ever done.
It's
I
the reason why he keeps
love
coming
him.
back to do it.
And he's so good at it. He's so good at just being like, he plays to his strengths really well, because a lot of people, like especially with action stars, they kind of get put into a bottle of like, this is what they can do, these are their limits. And instead of just, letting him play to his limits, he plays to his strengths, which is one, he doesn't have to say a whole lot to be scary.
Mm-hmm.
He is actually pretty expressive with his face too.
Oh yeah.
Particularly in this movie, he's scary.
Oh my
like
gosh.
a,
And I
a,
don't know, like it was because he was young. They're just talking about like it almost like he had no eyebrow. I was like,
well,
I'm
they
like,
got burned off.
oh, that's right.
Yeah,
I
they,
was sitting, I
they
was
got
like,
burned off in the nightclub scene.
see, that's what I get. Cause I was like, why does he look scarier later on in the?
Yeah,
We're good.
he's horrifying. His face is really scary, but it's the same thing like with Kyle Reese, where it's like you let them act with their eyes.
Mm-hmm.
And like my girlfriend's an actress, and she, like she has very great expressive eyes.
Mm-hmm.
And I realize that it's like so important. Like a lot of people are like, oh, like sometimes they talk about like, their voice or their line delivery or the way they deliver dialogue. But I think like one of the things that they really captured quite well in this movie is just the expression in their faces that amplified what they were going through in the entire movie. Like Kyle Reese expresses like fear and like panic, and Arnold Schwarzenegger just looks like he's gonna rip someone in half, which he
Yeah,
pretty
and
much
does.
does. He does the whole movie. And like, because people I guess had kind of given him a hard time about like how they didn't really think he was a good actor, and it was like, well, when he plays like this, when he plays to his strengths, he's excellent. He
And,
scared me so badly.
oh yeah, and like I don't think he was very far into his acting career when Terminator came. And
No,
so
I
I
think
think
he'd
it
done
just
Conan.
yeah, which he didn't he have people dubbed for him because he didn't know English yet,
Mm,
or
I've
was that
never
him
heard that.
speaking?
I've never heard that, but I think that no, I actually don't know. That's very new to me, so I'm gonna have to look that up.
Well, I know like when he did like Hercules in New York and like other stuff like that, he didn't know a lick of English, so they had to like dub it over.
Yeah, I,
Uh,
I think he knew English by the time he did Conan, but I can't
okay,
say for sure.
but I mean, I get what you're saying. Like you had to because you got this big. Well, we say huge. We keep thinking like Arnold's like 6'7", but he's like what 6'1".
He's six. His build is 6'2", but I think he's actually like nowadays. I think he's like 5'11", 5'10".
Okay. Um,
But he has a screen presence that kind of like one
makes him
because
look
he's
like he's 10 feet tall.
right. One, he's enormous because he's the world's most like well-known bodybuilder for a
Right.
reason. And he's just huge. Like because he's not the tallest guy. So
No,
he makes up for it by just being charismatic and being absolutely massive.
exactly. What I was saying is like, because like you said, he had done, goofier stuff like Hercules in New York, did Conan. And so, okay, coming into Terminator, when you see a guy that's just as gigantic as he is, and it's like, okay, so since you're not in pro wrestling, you're just here to look big and be a meathead. And it's like, no, he actually has a range. But it's just obviously at that point in his career, he was still learning. He was still like getting his craft down. And so like I agree with you. It's like that's why Terminator is like, you know what? You may still be working on the acting aspect of it. Physically, you're perfect. So let's just give you a role that just leans into all of that.
One thing I want to say uh, about Schwarzenegger, I forgot what I was just about to say. I had it on the tip of my tongue and then I immediately drew a blank. But you know what? You go ahead. Let it come back to my memory.
That's fine. I'll keep going. Because I know a lot of times, like even nowadays, they're not wrestlers, but well, yes. If you are just, it's like if you hit a certain like I don't know, like bulk size and muscle, it's like Hollywood's like, well, you clearly can't act. And it happened to The Rock, it happened to John Cena, and it's happened to Batista. And all three of them had to prove, like, no, 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 no. We can actually act. You just gotta give us roles that make sense for guys our size. And Arnie was kind of the one of the original guys having to deal with that. And
I have a story about that. So there's every movie that I've seen The Rock in. It's so particularly with Rampage a couple years
mm-hmm,
ago. He so they had him as a scientist in that movie that was studying apes, and they had to give him like an army ranger like background to explain why he was so massive.
why a scientist would be so huge?
Yeah, because he's like, yeah, I'm a scientist. I'm just like, I've never met a scientist that is just so jacked. Just so
Yeah,
like I don't like there's probably got to be one out there, but I've never met a scientist that is just built
not
like
to the Rock's
Hercules.
extent. Yeah,
Right.
exactly. Like I'm sure there's plenty that are like in good shape and you know good build, but they're not the Rock size.
Right. But they like always give him a background and I kind of appreciate that rather than just like, oh yeah, he's just only a scientist. Like they
Yeah.
give some way to attempt to explain like like the elephant in the room, the elephant being the Rock. Like, why is he so massive? And
Yeah, well, that's
like,
true.
I kind of love that, but like, I think they've had him. Well, when he was Hobbs, no, they were just like, yeah, he's a police officer, like he's a he's an international agent. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, that makes sense. Like, I can believe
Mm-hmm.
that. But I'm sure that like you mentioned, like Schwarzenegger was probably leading the way for a lot of people in
Oh yeah,
regards
that
of
you can
like
be like just because you're a massive guy does not mean you have to be basically uh there's more for you than just being the muscle for the actual, quote unquote good actor that's the mastermind or like basically being like the big muscular guy that James Bond has to be or whatever. There's more for you than
which Batista had a role in.
no, no. He loved it because he's a huge James Bond fan, so he ate that up.
Right, he was great in it. I remember, I think it was Mr. Hanks was his name.
I believe so.
Inspector. Yeah, I was like, he's a great Bond villain. He has only one line in that whole movie, but
Mm-hmm.
he makes really, really good use of his screen presence. And he's also proven that he has great comedic timing on top of
Oh
that.
my gosh, yes.
He's Drax. Like, he's
That's actually what I'm. Okay, now that I know we're slightly rabbit trailed here, talking about guys that had to prove that they can actually act despite being the size of mountains. But I'm noticing there's a through line with all of this because Arnold can be legitimately hilarious, and so can Batista, Cena, and The Rock.
yeah, once they
I don't
all
know what
get
it is.
comfortable, it's when they became
Yeah.
more comfortable in their roles because it's like, I don't want to say like when they settle into like more of like, well, okay, Arnold never wrestled, but like I've noticed with like Cena and The Rock is like kind of when they settle more into like who they are naturally, you see more of like their natural qualities where they're like, hey, they have good comedic timing. Like, hey, they actually are pretty funny when they do that. And I think like with Cena and Blockers, I don't know if you guys have seen that movie, but I loved him in that movie. He was perfect in that. Oh, I remembered what I wanted to say about Schwarzenegger.
Yes.
So, do you know that Arnold Schwarzenegger was not exactly the first option for the role of the Terminator. Do you want to know who was?
Well, I'm not shocked. Usually, iconic roles typically goes like the second option. So, who was the first option?
This is what I read online, and I think it was on a website called Uberfacts or something
So,
along
take,
that line. It was an article. O.J. Simpson.
huh?
And they passed on him because I don't know if it was James Cameron or if it was one of the producers, but they said that they didn't believe he could like portray a murderer.
Well, that aged poorly.
Yeah, but I mean, we're not here to talk about OJ, but I just thought that was really funny because they were like,
That is
yeah, I don't believe it.
hilarious.
But because it was back at the time when he was like at the peak of his career, so I was
Oh
like,
yeah, I mean, he was
I
doing
get that.
comedic movies and doing a good job at it.
Yeah, because he had charisma, and I think that they're like, no, like Schwarzenegger's probably better for this role, so they gave it to him. And boy, was that a good decision, because this is my favorite outside of like T2 for him. And well, I like Running Man too, but
Yes.
it's so good. I'm gonna rip out your spine.
I think the accent honestly helps. Like, there are certain like languages or like accents that when you hear them, there's a part of you, there's like almost like a primal fear. And I know he's like Austrian, but like German, since he knows how to speak German and all that, like when you hear that accent, there's just a part of you that goes, "Oh, I'm in trouble."
Oh, it's scary. And he like, with his line delivery, like there's moments where you can tell that he's adding like a slight bit of nuance to it. Like in
Mm-hmm.
the police scene where he utters the famous I'll be back" line. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to do the accent. I'm trying to avoid doing that as much as possible. But he
No one would blame you if you slipped into it. We've all done an
I know, and I
audition.
want to so badly, but it's like a bad British accent where it's like everyone's done it. So it's
Yeah.
like, it's like, I'm the Terminator, and then like, it's Tuesday in it. Like, it's the same bad accents that everyone's done to death.
It's all good.
And he when he's asking to see Sarah Connor, you can like see like little inflections in his voice where it's like, oh, he's actually like imitating being a human in a way that I think a robot would try to.
That's a good point. Like because like the guy said, goes, 'cause I think it was Kyle that explained like the previous models were like the T600s. They looked like humans, but because it was like rubber skin, you could easily pick them out.
Yeah. You're like, hey, why is Tim unable to move his neck?
Exactly. But like, so with this one, it's like now that they can perfectly replicate looking like a human, it's like, well, you look like it. Now you kind of have to act like one.
Right.
And I also get shown with how like he takes phrases he hears from other people and you
Yeah, he like has the conversations, which is like, it's super interesting, like watching. And that's another thing with visual storytelling too that I really liked about it, was seeing him, it's all on screen, and sometimes like you got to use like a little bit of dialogue, but they
mm-hmm,
had him like focus in, and you could tell what was going on. You're like, oh, that's going to come back later, like that's going to play in. And
mm-hmm.
it's kind of funny because like, the same thing happened in Predator years later, where he wasn't the predator, but the predator would copy people's like laughs and voices and like lead people off. And it's just like an interesting little twist. But
Yeah.
I really like that scene where he and we've talked about this before, but they use a lot of practical effects in this movie.
Mm-hmm.
And the scene where he's fixing his eye,
Yes, that has aged poorly.
right? And I'm not going to hold anything against that, because
No.
I don't know how to make good special effects.
Well, it's not even just that. It's like, because like talking to my parents and like my sisters and whatnot, like they're like, no, at the time, that was terrifying.
And it still kind of is, even if it's like you can look at it and you're like, that is very clearly like a
He's
robotic
very,
dummy.
yeah, or like he's very clear wearing at least a rubber actual face is not.
Right.
And
And it's kind of jarring when it's like he puts the sunglasses on and then immediately cuts back. You're like, huh.
yeah, like, oh, back to normal Arnold.
Yeah, you're like, ah, like that's almost the scariest part now. But it's like, now I look at it, instead of like being like, oh, that's very clearly not real, I can look at it and go like, that's a really interesting way of like, working with what you have on hand, and also being really, really economic with what you do have available in terms of like, because people can make good use of things, but like when you make something that good, for especially for the time too, like even if it hasn't aged super well, whatever, but
Yeah.
it's pretty amazing what they pulled off with like practical effects in this movie. But
Well,
let's also talk about the final scene with the robot.
oh god. Okay. Well, before we get to Raw, I will say they did a good job with that scene with the eye where you still felt uncomfortable the whole time because it's playing like this brooding music. Because since he's a robot, he doesn't feel pain. So he's just because normally when you see a movie where someone has to like cut themselves up in order themselves or cut out a bullet, you see them like in pain and all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, they're like
And
screaming and chugging
exactly,
whiskey. Yeah.
exactly, or like they're trying, or they're like bite down on something. You just see them like wincing as they're like seeing themselves. So when you hear this brooding music, and he is just emotionally just like cut, cut, fix the arm, take out the eye, and just very methodical. Well, robotic. And it's just that kind of led to like, oh, I'm uncomfortable that he could just because since he looks like a human, you're like, oh, he should be struggling and like being in pain right now, but he's not.
It almost
And it
kind of
kind of
works.
helps drive that point home.
It almost works better in that regard because, like, when you look at it through that lens, you're like, oh, like he literally feels nothing this whole time. And like the fact that it doesn't look real almost makes it just as scary because you're like, this is a robot literally fixing itself. That's
Yes.
frightening. That's actually terrifying when you put it that way.
Yeah. So like that's them also like I'm sure they didn't think, oh, I'm sure in 30, in 30 years, well, it's almost there, but 26 years from now, this will look not that good. So we got to make up like there's like, no, what else can we do to make it scary? Besides just the obvious, like he's taking his eye out, her. It's like, what else can we do besides just that to make it uncomfortable?
I mean, I don't know. I appreciate that scene for what it is because it's not super, super gory, but it's very uncomfortable. And
Yeah.
speaking of uncomfortable, let's talk about that
Yes.
robot reveal
Now
at
we
the
will.
very
Yes. I just,
end.
yeah.
I
Oh,
love it so much.
look, when it's in a still shot, it actually looks fine. It's that initial shot when it's coming out of the fire that looks
I
like I was like, is this the original like Clash of the Titans? What am I looking at?
and I want to give them credit because the actual design of it is really, really good.
Oh, it looks terrifying.
It look it looks fantastic. The design is really like it's economic, it's simple, and it's scary, which is exactly what it should be. But when it moves is when you're like, oh, okay, this is like, this is different. Like, not to take anything away from it, because they did so much right with it. But it's like
Mm-hmm.
when you watch it move, you're like, oh, it's kind of like, like almost stop motion a little bit, or like
Yeah.
claymation, where it's like it's kind of moving along. But it looks really, really good when it's like grappling with Kyle, or when it's like, like crawling through the presser at the end towards Sarah Connor
Mm-hmm.
and like grabbing her like that. That whole scene, I was like,
Oh no, like dude, if I know obviously like for some people, because I know some people are sticklers for how a movie looks. So some people won't be able to get beyond the fact the robot doesn't look great by today's standards. But it's just if you can, yeah, your heart is going as fast as possible during that whole scene because you're just like you just hit them with your best shot. You literally put a pipe bomb in the exhaust of an 18 wheeler and it blew up, and that wasn't enough to kill the dang thing.
which that's scary as it is, because it's like the scariest part of the movie is not that he's a robot. Like, I mean, that adds to the fear factor of it. But the scariest part is that he literally is almost a force of nature in the way that he cannot be stopped.
Exactly. And just a small detail, I do like that because it could have been a detail they could have easily have left out. But when he was just a pure robot, he still had the limp,
Yep.
and I appreciate that.
And it kind of fit perfectly with what they're, because it like the motion, was kind of like a little off for the, well, it was the 80s, so like they were working with what they had,
They did the
and
best they could.
they
Yeah.
did the best they could. And it almost kind of added to it by having that limp because it looked a little bit more natural. And it's a
And
small deal. It's a small detail I can appreciate too. Like as someone who's done script supervision, I really appreciate that.
yeah, it makes me wonder if they put that in for that reason. Kind of
I
like it's like with Jaws when they, Spielberg talks about how much of a nightmare it was.
Yeah. Well, they
It makes
probably
me
had a lot.
wonder.
Go ahead.
Hmm?
Go ahead.
Oh, okay, but like, it makes me wonder if, like, because of stories like that, if James Cameron's sitting there going, okay, let's give, since we already know we're gonna struggle getting it to walk like a normal human, we need to have something happen to Arnold to where he has a limp.
I think so, but I also think that they like really kept that part in the movie because they probably had a really good script supervisor, which for anyone who's listening to this and doesn't know what a script supervisor is, a script supervisor is basically someone who manages continuity on set. So like if you have a room, if you're filming in a room and you have everything placed a certain way, let's say you have a glass in a frame and that glass is full of a liquid up to a certain point and someone drinks it in that shot and then you repeat that shot, one of the script one of the script supervisor's jobs is to make sure that it has the same or close to the same amount of water so that it flows along with what the movie's looking like. So they probably had that attention to detail of like like the script supervisor, like they're like, all right, we're gonna have a move, and they're like, don't forget the lamp, don't forget the
True.
lamp. Like because I've done script supervision, and there was like a scene working with dominoes, and I had to replace all the dominoes in the way that they were in the previous shot. So
Oh man.
yeah, it's a lot of detail. So I think that one, it was probably James Cameron paying attention, and two, the script supervisor, like, hey, he's got to have a limp. Like, because every single little detail about the Terminator is presented in the film and kept throughout the film.
Yeah, like after he goes through one of the most, like, honestly, of all the entire franchise, no matter which, no matter what your feelings may be about the franchise as a whole, one of the most iconic scenes in all the movies is obviously when he does the "I'll be back," comes crashing through with the car, and then just basically wages war on the police station.
Oof.
And uh, I guess I didn't catch it when I was younger because I wasn't really, but I realized watching it back recently that all the bullet holes in like his jacket and like a blood stain on his pants and all that, it was still there even during the final car chase.
That's called continuity, Caleb.
No, that's great, man, because they could have, like, I don't know, he could have gotten another jacket or something. But
Yeah.
like it added to like the intimidation factor of like, yeah, here's all these battle scars and he's still going.
And it keeps the story like tight and focused on where it is. Like with that in mind, like even if it's just a small detail, like it kind of forces the viewer's brain to go like, oh, this is all happening like within this short amount of time, because you could very easily get lost in terms of like, if the Terminator shows up with new clothes, you're like, is it a day later, is it 2 days
Exactly.
later, is it hours later? Like I have no idea. And just that attention to detail too, one, it shows how good James Cameron is because he's amazing, but it also just shows an attention to detail that I really appreciate about not only just, maintaining, high quality for the movie, but also just maintaining story and character, because that continuity adds to the terrifying factor of like this giant dude walking around covered in blood, not saying a word, and
Yeah.
will
That's the
not
other thing too.
kill.
He's silent. So he kind of has like that Mike Myers thing or like Jason Voorhees where you're sitting like, at least scream in pain, something.
Yeah. Well, they have him as a funny story about that. They have him as a character in Mortal Kombat 11, and every time people do a fatality on him, he doesn't make a sound.
That's good. Well,
It's
NetherRealm
perfect.
Studios is they're excellent about making sure things stay accurate to the source material. So I'm not shocked to know they made sure that that was accurate.
Yeah, and I mean, it would be easy to kind of add like even like a little grunt, like, if he's getting a fatality performed on him and you just hear, ooh, uh, but like they don't even do that. Like it just imitates exactly how I think the Terminator would react, and it's like it's a nice detail, especially for someone like me who loves the Terminator movies.
Mm-hmm.
And I just love it. I love it so much, and I love the way
Yeah.
that Arnold portrayed him. But
Oh yeah.
I kind of want to talk about Sarah Connor now, especially since we've
Sure.
kind of gone over almost the whole cast.
Yeah. I mean, you gotta cover the big three, and she's the last.
Exactly. She's the most important part of the movie. I love, well, I mean, we mentioned it earlier in the episode, but her character arc is one of my favorite character arcs in almost any 80s movie, just because Linda Hamilton just does this again with her eyes. She expresses still fear. And even at the end, when she changes from going to like, like a very understandably frightened woman, like this young
Yeah.
woman who was literally just at her waitress job and she's dealing with rude customers and she's having a rough day.
Hmm.
And she goes from that to like very clearly terrified by what's going on around her to someone who is still terrified, but is now fully believing in who she is and what she can do. And when she says to Kyle Reese, like, "On your feet, soldier," and she, gets him moving, and because he dies halfway through that fight.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
He, spoiler alert for a 40-something-year-old movie.
Oh yeah. It's like it's yeah. It's almost 40 years old now. So no.
If you haven't seen the Terminator, then that's on you. And
Yeah.
he because Kyle Reese he's just done. Like, he's out of commission. Like, he doesn't die immediately, but you're like, yeah, he's not getting up.
Yeah.
And she has to take on the Terminator by herself, which even with a group of people, I wouldn't want to take on a Terminator.
No, and the way she has to take them on too, I just love how they portrayed it because it's like Kyle does one last like it's almost kind of like that last stand like with his final bit of energy and final breath. It's like because he has the final pipe bomb, blows the Terminator in half, and you're thinking, okay, now she doesn't have to deal with it. They've won, and then the top half of the thing starts to move.
You didn't go for the head. You should have gone for the head, and he didn't. He was like, "What if I put it in like its tailbone?" And I was like, I mean, oh, Kyle.
I mean, the man was dying. He's not going to be able to think super straight.
She was literally carrying the entire team on her back for that entire part of the movie because he had just gotten thrown through the ringer, and he's just like, "Please let me die." Like, at that point, he's like, "Oh my gosh, I'm not gonna make it," and he,
Yeah.
finally does some damage. But a crawling Terminator is still a Terminator,
Yep.
and that
One
was
arm crawling Terminator because that's
it's
important to
so
note.
scary. It's so, and he's just like grabbing her and holding her, and she had to lead it. Like, it's so smart. Like, she didn't say anything. She wasn't like, "I'm gonna take him over to the presser machine." Like,
Hmm.
she just knew where to go, and it was very clear what she was trying to do. But it was still scary because you're like, is she gonna get it? Like, is the Terminator gonna get her? And then, she's like, "You've been terminated." And we're still a clean podcast, so I'm not going to drop that F-bomb.
Yes.
But she, crushes him, and it was really smart. And even then, you're just like, "Oh my gosh."
Oh, it was such a cathartic moment. Oh my gosh. Like you feel the same amount of relief that she's feeling while the thing's getting like just crunched.
Yeah, if you like breathing, you probably shouldn't watch this movie. Just full
And then
disclosure.
and I love the way they did it because after everything the Terminator has been put through, you're just like, okay, what makes this different? And the shot of watching the red in the eyes go out, and you're like, okay, now it's dead.
Oh, it was so nice. I was like, "Oh, I can breathe." Like, oh, everything's gonna be fine. And then I remembered there's a sequel, and I was like, well, it was good while it lasted.
Well, it came 7 years later, so I mean,
They took their time, and yeah, like, it's also a very different kind of stressful too. Like, they happen to take this Terminator, who's already unbelievably scary, and then make him scarier in the second one, which we'll talk about T2. We'll have a whole episode about T2.
oh, of course, we have to. It's one of my favorites.
Yeah,
By law, we have to.
it's a long, it might be a little ways away, but it's not long away. But we will talk about it because that's, a movie that's had a big impact on both of us.
Yeah, you can't talk about the first one without mentioning the second one.
Right. It's they're just, they go so well together. It's a perfect
Mm-hmm.
double feature for this kind of movie. And I love this movie. I love all the side characters too, even the cops. Like, they managed to like, even though like they're condescending towards one of the main characters because one, he sounds like he's completely not from this universe. And he like they kind of add a little bit of like humor and levity to the entire situation. They also, this was interesting because the whole time she's like, how did you shoot him, and then he got back up, and like how did he keep going after that, and they had explanations for it.
Oh yeah, they're like he was on PCP. He could break his hand and not feel it first.
Yeah,
I'm
they
like, oh,
didn't
that's a good explanation.
they didn't completely dismiss her, but they're like, look, these are our explanations for what we think happened, and you could see it in her eyes. She's like, oh
Yeah,
wow, like I didn't even think
it
about that.
it made her start second guessing herself of like, oh, of course, when you go through that initial like scene, she's fully believing Kyle, or at least trusting him because he literally saved her life.
Right.
And but then when the cops are presenting all that stuff, then she's like, maybe he is crazy, and maybe I shouldn't believe him.
Right. She kind of
Uh,
relaxed for like half a second, which was a mistake. You don't
yeah,
relax when you're being chased by the Terminator. That's
yeah. Oh, that's why that. I mean, like you said earlier about Kyle being just very over. His most over the top is when he's being interviewed by,
yeah,
and especially when he starts looking at the camera, and he's just, you don't understand. He will not stop. He will find her.
yeah. And they're just like, okay, big guy. And then he came in, and that scene was really, really, really tense.
Oh yeah, it's like the center. It's like the tent pole moment of that whole movie.
Right. I don't think I've seen a movie like that, especially from that time period where it's like, especially like involving cops. Like that was really frightening.
Yeah, just watching him mow through these guys, especially because the cops are like, and the funny thing is too, they kept. I didn't catch it when when I watched it years ago, but they're declaring him a terrorist, which is like, well, yeah, of course he is. If you don't think he's a robot, then the next best thing is terrorist. And so like they're pulling out all the big guns, and they're just like short of throwing grenades and rocket launchers at him.
Yeah.
Uh,
It also proved just how like, I know usually in early on in the movie is when they establish like how big of a threat like the villain is or the antagonist is in the movie. But this movie just amplifies it on another level because it's like you're going in a place that has firepower, the ability to defend itself, and he just goes through it like Swiss cheese. Like
oh
it's
yeah, no,
nothing.
the lieutenant says it when he gets Sarah to sleep on to try and take a nap on the bed because there's 30 cops in this precinct right now. You're as safe as can be.
No,
And it's
you're
like, no, you're
not.
not.
You're not when you have the Terminator.
Oh yeah, and it's just. But to your point about like with Sarah, of how, because obviously it gets fully realized in the second movie when you just see how drastically different she is, but and like in a good way. Not, and I think we spoke on, or maybe you mentioned it earlier, of like someone who gets changed for convenience, or someone like a complete personality swap of, oh, I was like this and now I'm like this. Her change makes sense. Like, yeah, she's now battle hardened. She literally had to stare death in the face multiple times in the span of like what, a day and a half.
She's gone through the ringer in every sense of the word, and even at the end she still has character traits that show that it's her. It's not like she just becomes this invincible world beater. Like she's
Yeah.
still very, very human, and she's still very scared, but now she trusts herself enough to try and save herself and do things that she would never have had to do before.
Yeah, and that's why I like about the ending too, and like getting gas and all that. And yeah, the it is a cheat, and I just chalked that up to the decade it was made in. Of when the guy's like, there's a storm brewing. Yes, there is. And she just looks up. I was like, that's a byproduct of the 80s. But
and I wouldn't have it any other way.
no, I love it. It's like that's some 80s cheese and I love it.
It's
But
so good.
no, but like then after going through such a harrowing experience, there's a lot of choices she could have made of like how, like, what do I do now? Now that I have all this information, now I'm pregnant, and the person, she already knows it's a boy. She knows she's going to name it John, and he's no big deal. He's just the savior of the universe. And her first thing is, I got to start preparing. And you see that with her recording stuff to like eventually hand down to John.
Mhm.
And I love the little conundrum she talks about because she's like, should I tell you about your father? Because if I do you send him back because you get too emotionally attached to him, or do you already know who he is? Because you had to send him back. So you could go crazy thinking about all this.
That's a really weird talk. Like, well, I've thought about that a lot, but like, that's just so weird.
I think it's a great way of the movie acknowledging this is the stuff we've presented to you is odd. It's not like they're going to suddenly be like, see, this all makes crystal clear, perfect sense. Don't question anything. It's
It's
like,
just
no,
so
they wrote it in of like the characters are questioning it, going, wait a second.
talk about like having like parental issues of like, well, I mean, they obviously explore that in the second movie really well, but it's just like, so like, how do you explain that to people? It's like, oh, where's your dad? And he's like, oh, like he's not born yet. You're like, what?
Yeah, it's like technically you're older than your own father.
Which is
What?
weird. I don't like that. Make it stop.
I
Send
was
it
like,
back. I want a receipt.
I was there. I was like, I think I know where Futurama got the idea for one of their episodes.
And that's the thing, is like the Terminators had an impact on so many things, like especially sci-fi in particular, that
Oh
like
gosh,
people
the
don't
killer
even
robot.
realize. Yeah.
The whole kill, like, I'm obviously like cheesy sci-fi movies from like the 50s had killer robots in them, but
Right.
the way the Terminator did it, it's like if you say killer robot, I mean, like I said earlier, it's synonymous. Killer robot means Terminator.
Yep.
And any movie that makes a killer robot is immediately, if it looks like a human, is immediately going to be compared to that.
There's also a really funny use of the Terminator theme song in
Oh yeah,
in
yeah, that scene,
Sausage Party.
the piano version.
when the store owner shoots the gum and then he just reforms.
Oh my lord.
Oh, but like, look at how far it's come. You know, it was made in the 80s, and then it was in that movie about like food animating and coming to life.
Oh yeah, it's the first two movies especially, because I mean, just to let you know, we're not going to talk about three onwards. No.
I think we should talk about Dark Fate actually.
One
Eventually,
day.
we'll get there. I
um,
like certain things about Dark Fate, and I think that it also brings the original, like the first and second movie, to an interesting, I don't want to, well, not necessarily conclusion, but it adds an interesting layer to it in a certain way that I think would be
gotcha.
interesting to explore a little bit. And like, we
Okay.
can talk about like, what we really, really like about T1 and T2, and then how Dark Fate is different.
Oh yeah.
Because it
But
is.
like to, but like to get to the, well, it says like you were saying with Terminator, like of just the impact it's had on just honestly everything. Uh, because it's like when people, it's like a Boston Dynamics as this company that they work on robotics. And yeah, exactly. See, and why do you do that? Because of the Terminator movies.
Because
Or like one of the funniest things that cracked me up was people were coming up with what would tech companies actually call themselves if they could get away. And it went Google because Skynet was already taken.
it's true.
And
But I don't
but it's
think
just
Google's building killer robots. Like,
yet.
don't give them any ideas.
But just like even the opening sequence of Terminator when it's playing the iconic theme, and it's just like giving you the typical like Arnold Schwarzenegger, Linda Hamilton, and in it, like the way the letters are going across each other. I just went there, I just saw that, and I went, "Is that what Stranger Things bases their intro off of?"
Yes.
Yeah, it's like yeah, clearly, because it's doing the exact same thing that show does.
Well, I mean, Stranger Things is very much a tribute and an homage to like everything from the 80s, which
Well, yeah, but when you have a kid cast, you can't really talk about the. too much because obviously they'd be too young to see that.
Well, hold on now. Well, hold on. Let hold on.
Well, maybe now because like now they're like in what, middle school.
No, 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 no. Let's talk about the 80s for a second. RoboCop, which again,
Okay.
a future episode. They used to market RoboCop toys to kids.
Heck yeah.
But the thing is that RoboCop is significantly more graphic.
Oh yeah, he's not a efficient killer like the Terminators.
Oh,
He
no.
is like, it is. What is the bloodiest way I can kill you?
Well, the thing is that RoboCop is also a metaphor for Jesus in a different way. He's obviously more of a heroic character, but like that movie is filled with blood and gore,
Oh
and
yeah.
that's one of my favorite things about the 80s is though, like, you know what would be really good to do with this R-rated graphic movie that we're marketing to people over 18? Make toys for children.
Well,
That's so 80s.
one of my other favorite movies that's from the 80s is Who Framed Roger Rabbit. And oh my, does the end of that movie with Doom,
I had
with Judge
nightmares.
Doom. Oh,
Oh
my
my
gosh.
dude. I love the 80s. The 80s rules.
They did not care.
In that regard, I would like in the space of like movies and like the impact they had on everything in the future, I love what they contribute.
I agreed. That's what I was trying to say. Like, it just, and two, I was thinking like, uh, an interesting parallel since we're talking about 80s movies. You can't talk about the Terminator, especially with it having a female hero, without also talking about Alien, which you mentioned earlier.
Which James
And
Cameron is excellent at having like female protagonists, and he's had a really huge impact on the genre in general. Like some of the most iconic action protagonists and action heroines are Sarah Connor and Ripley.
yes, both easily number one, number two, or not even number one. It's literally like 1A, 1B.
I would
And,
agree. Yeah, I agree.
and, uh, and it's just interesting that because we talked about how like the second movie of Terminator is clearly an action film. The first one's more like a slasher with some horror elements of just that suspense of that sense of dread. I realized thinking about it, I was like, Alien to Aliens does the same thing.
Very similar, except Ridley Scott did the first Aliens, and then he handed the reins over to James Cameron.
Yeah.
Oh, they're so good. They're so good.
Yeah, I'm just saying, like, I just think that's interesting because, like, not believe me, this will make sense in a second. Because, like, sometimes when people, like, for instance, like a horror, like video games, they'll get mad when as sequels become more action focused. And it's like they pointed out, I was like, well, because you're not going to be scared of the same thing when you've seen it before.
Right. I mean,
And so,
look at Resident Evil, and then look at Resident Evil 6.
do we have to? I like a third of that game.
It's just a comparison, okay?
I like a third of the game.
Am I wrong? Am I wrong?
Could you at least say RE1 to RE4?
Am I wrong, Caleb? Tell me I'm wrong.
No, you're not. But
that's
doing
right. That's
okay.
Right.
No. You're that's unfair, and you know it because comparing Alien and Aliens, Terminator 1 to 2, the correct Resident Evil comparison would be RE1 to 4.
But I'm talking about their transition from horror all the way to action because RE4 still has quite a few horror elements.
Fair. Then RE5 because at least that was still a good game.
RE5 was a great game. I
exactly. 6 is not.
Hey,
5 was at least still good.
But am I wrong, Caleb? I'm sorry. Okay, that's the last
time I
do that.
You're fine. You're fine. No, it actually works. You helped make my point of horror movies or video games. They have to become more action because as humans, we get used to seeing the same scary, even if it's the most terrifying thing possible. We become familiar with it. It's why, like the Jason movies, you start cheering for Jason after a while. Or like the Freddy movies, you don't care about the kids. You're hoping Freddy kills them the most over-the-top way possible.
Yeah, and the thing with Friday the 13th is that like the people making the movies, the producers were like, look, we know what people really like about these movies. And it's not so much, well, I mean, obviously they want to see Jason on screen because like he's kind of scary in that regard, but people are there for the kills.
Exactly.
And they leaned into that, which is really smart because like franchises evolve over time. and it's a natural progression, especially like, have you seen Jason Lives?
No, sorry.
So it's no, that's fine. That's fine. It's a comparison of like the first one was very much straight up horror, but the sixth movie in the series, Jason Lives, starts with Jason Voorhees, like he gets resurrected. Spoiler alert. And he when he gets introduced, like it goes into his eye, and then you see him do like a James Bond walk into the circle and then slash the screen. And from that moment forward, I was like, this is going to be a very different movie than I think you, and because it's almost like a self parody, and they have like little fourth wall breaks, and
Yeah.
it's a natural progression. Like some people kind of feel weird about that movie, but I kind of like when film franchises do that and they just
Yeah.
progress
And
naturally.
yeah, and I bring all this is to come back. Like I said, it will, as I promised. This makes sense. Is that Terminator as well also progresses. Because the second one, like I said, being an action movie, it's also more over the top. It doesn't become gory. There's not suddenly like intestines or anything else. But the kills are definitely more gruesome
Yeah.
in the second one. They took everything about the first movie and said, okay, let's just go higher with it. That's fine. They don't really complain with Terminator because it pumped out even better movies, so people aren't going to complain about it.
Right.
But um it just seems like I just find it very interesting that when you see these horror franchises that almost kind of like it's a necessary evil for them to become more action based, or like in your what you're talking about with like with Jason, it has to become a self parody. It's
Right.
very interesting to watch that progression.
Right. And every movie franchise does it differently. And I kind of appreciate, like, the first two Terminator movies is like, it was very natural and they kept it to that. And I can look at both of the movies now, especially the original Terminator, because in my opinion, it's almost as big of a feat in terms of what they pulled off, especially in the genre that they're working in with what they
Oh,
had. And that's
oh yeah,
it's beautiful, wonderful filmmaking at its finest. And if you love science fiction and you love horror, or if you don't like either of them but you love a fun, thrilling movie with thrilling chase sequences, and which, by the way, quick note, great car sequence chases in this movie. I know
oh
I
my
just
gosh, yes. I
I
mean, we kind of took some not shots, but we addressed the elephants in the room about like the robot or the car chases are just as good now as they were.
oh, they hold up extremely well, and everything in the movie in terms of like practicality and the practical effects they do lands very, very well.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just a great movie. It's a lot of fun, and it also was a precursor to one of my favorite action films of all time. And I mean,
Yeah.
that in conclusion, I would say if anybody has this movie on DVD or if it's readily available online, I think that you should give it a watch.
Even if you've seen it before, like myself, like I said at the beginning, I was kind of I was trying to talk Austin too. And I'm glad he talked me into watching the first one again. So even if you haven't, even if you have seen it before, but it's been who knows how many years, give it a watch again with a fresh perspective of knowing what it's setting up. Then you'll see the little things like when the Terminator robot loses his arm at the end. That's the arm that plays a major factor in the next movie. You'll see things like that, and just like what Austin's saying, like appreciate what they pulled off with the limitations they had, both in budget and with special effects.
Exactly. And to quote Schwarzenegger in the movie, I don't think I'm going to get this exactly right, but 40 megawatt plasma rifle. And you know what you got? Just what you see, Mac. God,
Just what you
I
see.
definitely ruined that quote, but you get the point. Either way,
No, it's a great little moment.
thank you guys for tuning in today and for listening to us talk about Terminator. I am really excited about next week's episode, and yeah, let us know like your feedback, your thoughts about this episode. Maybe if you learned something new, you can let us know. And yeah, thank you guys for joining us today.
Yeah, I had a blast. I hope y'all did too. And yeah, go out and watch this. We guarantee you'll enjoy it.
And just a reminder, guys, we are the Internet World Order. I'm Austin Cook,
And I am Caleb McLemore.
and I hope you guys have a great weekend. Thank you.
See you guys.